And I should stop my video.
I'll introduce you first.
Fine.
I said I'll introduce you first.
Okay.
And we're live. So, welcome everyone to this evening's speaking engagement with Rob Nossen. We are going to begin today's session by showing off a video of a presentation that he gave for a group of students. And as you can see, he is on the Zoom call with me right now. And we're going to start the video presentation, and then he will be available afterwards to answer any of the questions that you may have. So certainly this can be very interactive. Please use the YouTube chat functionality. As long as you're signed in, you are welcome to place in respectful questions and comments for Rob, our speaker tonight. And I will certainly relay the questions that you place into the chat or the comments that you place into the chat over to him. So let me start the screen sharing of the video. Now we can mute and turn off our video. Before we continue on with the video, it seems that there is some audio difficulty, that the audio is not coming over to our YouTube audience. So let me just change a couple settings very quickly and see if we can get that working. I certainly apologize. So, share. And please let me know within the YouTube chat if you are able to hear everything properly.
My name is Rob Nossen, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. I wasn't born when the Holocaust started. As you know, the Holocaust started in 1933 in Germany, and it affected my parents immediately because they were living in Germany at the time. My family is from there. They had been there for generations. They were fully assimilated Jews, and they looked just like the rest of us, like I look now, and they were proud to be German. Just as an aside, during the First World War, there was a higher percentage of Jews in the German army than any other group. So they were they had full citizenships. It's not typically what you think about the Holocaust. But Hitler came to power in 1933 and immediately went after the Jews. You'll see that when within months, he started going after the Jews. My parents saw this, and unlike most Jews, my father had the opportunity to leave because his company had subsidiaries in Denmark and Belgium. So in the winter, actually in the autumn of 1933, my father and my brother and my mother went to Denmark. And my father worked there, and he traveled back and forth to Germany during this time for his company. And then he could only stay there 18 months because of work limitations, so then he ended up in Belgium. That was in 1935. And in 1936, my father took a position with a Dutch company in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and settled there more permanently. I was born there in 1938. Everything was fine. I mean, we had family members trying to get to the United States. Quite a few did make it to the United States. But I had relatives going to the Dominican Republic, Shanghai, Palestine, you name it. They went wherever they could. Because what Hitler was trying to do was kick the Jews out of Germany. He wasn't trying to kill them at that point. That came later. He just wanted them out of Germany. But other countries didn't take them. So that was part of a problem when we ran in. You'll see that in the museum. But the problem was then, so after Kristallnacht, which was on November 9th, 1938, about another dozen family members joined my parents in Holland, or Netherlands. I call it Holland rather than Netherlands. But and because they had driven out, so and so they were there as refugees. And so that was the way it was until 1940. Now Hitler the Germans invaded Holland in 1940, in May 1940. And it was attacked, they firebombed Rotterdam, destroyed the city completely. We tried to get to England by boat. My parents had been to England. We had relatives in England, but the roads were blocked. We couldn't even get out. Holland fell in a matter of 5 days, and a threat of bombing after Rotterdam, and there was a threat of bombing other cities, so Holland surrendered. At the time, there were approximately 130,000 Jews living in Holland. Again, a relatively small percentage of the total population of about roughly about 20,000, 25,000 were German Jews that had gotten into Holland, got out of Germany. But that's how far they got. When Holland was invaded, and then the other Western European countries fell soon after, the Germans kind of left us alone. They didn't do anything to us. They registered to us, although they had that information anyway. But for the first year, they didn't do anything to us. But in 1941, a year later, they started with the restrictions that they had done in Germany years before. Not allowed in public parks, sports places, swimming pools, restaurants, drive cars, and travel outside of town limits. So in effect, the towns became the ghettos, what we call ghettos. So Amsterdam really became what we call a ghetto. You could travel within Amsterdam without any problems. We were not limited and so forth. But there were restrictions on shopping and stuff like that. In 1942, the Jewish Star came in, and we were separated from the Christians. Now, at that time, obviously, I was 4, and that included the schools. We could no longer go to public school or anything else. So what happened, the Jews in Amsterdam set up their own schools. And my brother went there, and he was in the same school with Anne Frank, but he was a year behind her. She was there for several months before they went into hiding. But my brother stayed in the school, and then all Jews in Holland were basically forced to move into Amsterdam. But we were limited to what we could do. In September, my grandmother died. She was living with us. And we had to get a special permit to bury her or to attend her funeral, because that was outside the city limits. In January 1943, then my grandfather was taken. And what the Germans did, they went after the elderly first, pretty much, who couldn't work, who were not employed, and so forth. Now, my father continued to work throughout this time. My mother tried to stop the Germans from taking my grandfather, but she was threatened that they would take her as well if she left him alone. And I was there when this happened, because she couldn't, there was nobody she could leave me with. In June 1943, there was a major roundup of all Jews in the West. So we were taken to this place called Westerbork. Westerbork was like a transit camp, and from there you would go to other camps. It was like a staging area. Now, every country in the West had one of these staging areas, because and people were rounded up from different areas, brought there, and from there they were shipped out to the concentration camps or the death camps. It was not a concentration camp, but they had factories, some factories there, and so forth. This is the deportation, people waiting to get, to be deported. This is the roundup and people being put on trains and so forth and arriving. This is the living areas. And by the way, in the ghettos and in these transit camps, you wore civilian clothes and you had a Jewish star. You did not wear the stripes. Only in the concentration camps and the slave labor camps did you wear that. So this is more of the roundup, people coming in by train. This is a morning muster, and there were a couple of thousand people there waiting to be transferred, and people would come and go. It had been set up actually in 1938-39 as a refugee camp for the Jews, because they were coming in so fast they didn't know where to put them, so they built this camp, and then it became this transit, obviously fenced and everything like that. We were there from June of 1943 to September of 1943, and my father ended up helping the Germans, and his company set up a factory in there, but they wanted him back. His company, which he had worked for, he was a senior engineer, he had a doctorate in engineering, and they said they need him for the production, for the work that they were doing for the German government, for the German defense forces. And they got him back. So in September 1943, we came back to Amsterdam. Now, we had lost everything in the process. Now, we had lived in the same apartment, from 1936 until 1943. And my father went to work every day during the war, except when we were in the camps. He would ride his bicycle. We didn't have cars around it. Most people didn't. To where he would get a ferry. The plant was on the other side, on an island, and go back. And he did that throughout that time frame. So in September 1943, we came back, and we got these papers that my father had applied to in March of 1943. This is what they call a certificate of citizenship. And this one happens to be El Salvador. It's in French. Why? Because this came out of the consulate in Geneva. And this basically said, we are El Salvadoran citizens. Now, my parents were German, my brother was German. I was stateless, even though I was born in Holland, because Europe doesn't have what we call birthright, which means if you're born in a country, you're automatically a citizen. That's not the case in Europe, in most of Europe at least. So I was stateless. I had no nationality, really. I wasn't German because my parents were, and I could apply for German citizenship later on. Or I could apply for Dutch citizenship when I turned 18, registered and go in the military and so forth. But we didn't stay that long. In any event, these papers gave us, when we got those papers gave us more rights. In the meantime, we ended up with almost like a tenement apartment, a very small apartment, walk up, third floor walk up. And as I said, by that time, the Germans had also closed the school, so my brother could no longer go to school. The only person that accepted, so we were kind of stuck. But with these papers, we were considered foreigners. And there was a special category for Jews that were foreigners, that were not involved in the war and so forth. So they kind of treated us special. And we had some special rights. We had more freedom to move around and so forth. And that went on until September of 1944. So from September 1943 to September 1944, we were living on restricted conditions with limited resources. There was rationing going on and stuff like that. We had, but we were surviving. And we were living in an apartment. My father's company got us some furniture and stuff like that. So, it seems compared to what other people were going through, we were in pretty good shape. But then we got caught up in the invasion, D-Day landings in June of 1944. Because what happened, the Allies came into France, liberated Belgium, and then liberated the southern part of Holland. Well, if you look at a map of Holland, you'll see that Amsterdam is pretty far north. The Allies decided to ignore it, just go east into Germany, and leave that section of Holland, the northern part where we were, alone. So we were not liberated until April of 1945. But then in September, they rounded up the last Jews, including the foreigners that we were, and then sent us to a place called Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a ghetto, similar to Warsaw, but it was different. Theresienstadt had been a fortress built 150 years before the war. It was a garrison town as well, so I had soldiers there, and so forth. At that time, there were about 7,500 people living there, civilians. And so what the Germans did in 1940-41 turned it into a ghetto. Now, this fortress, this was a fortress. There were two parts to it, actually, several parts. There's a little fortress and then the main fortress. The little fortress there had already turned into a concentration camp. And there were about a couple of thousand people there in a small fortress. And they were not Jews. These were more local and so forth. Now, Theresienstadt, throughout the years, had about 150,000 people going through there. Of the 150,000, less than 20,000 survived. Up to 50,000 living in an area, at any one time, living in an area previously with less than 7,500 people. So they built additional barracks, they squeezed people in and so forth. Every camp that Germany had, even this one, had a crematorium. You have to understand, this is much further north than being down here. And in the winters, unless you bury the people quite deep, they're going to come back up again on you, unless you have coffins. Now, they didn't use coffins, obviously, because so many people died. So what do? They couldn't bury them. It was difficult. So they built this crematorium, and then they had all these ashes. So they had a depository where they kept the ashes. This is a picture of today, if you visit it. This is the cemetery for the people that died after the war, when the war was over. Because, as I said, over 30,000 people died there, and most of them were cremated. Typical sign, the Arbeit macht frei. You'll see it later on in the museum. We have it as a symbol, but it was over every camp. Obviously, that was a false statement. There was no way that you were ever going to get out of there if the Germans had their way. This is children's art. I don't know if you heard about the children's art of Theresienstadt. It's quite famous. It was like an orphanage in Theresienstadt. So they had a whole school, they had a whole place for children, a whole barracks for children. And they had children art program, they had concerts and things going on. This was the ghetto for Czechoslovakia. So most of the people that ended up in were from Czechoslovakia. But there were also people, special standing, people that had won the Iron Cross in the First World War and so forth. There were Danish Jews there that did not get smuggled out to Sweden in 1943, but these were the ones that didn't make it. Now, the concept of a ghetto is different. The ghetto, within the ghetto, it's run by the Jews under the control of the Nazis. So we had money, we had fake money. We had, all of these, we had ration cards and all of this stuff. We were there from September 1944 until May of 1945. We first lived in barracks, then in one room, in the officers' quarters, the old officers' quarters. There were 5 rooms there, 5 families. Each family had a room. They shared a kitchen and a bathroom. So we were relatively well off again. My mother ended up working. My mother had sewn some money into a spindle. You know what a spindle is? Yarn and so forth. Well, she had sewn some money in there. And, black market works, and they were trying to take it away from her. She said, no, her sewing kit. And she said, no, we need it, and so forth, and they let us keep it. Because they took everything else away from us when we got the Theresienstadt. So we were sent there in September. We were in a boxcar for about 36 hours. Everything you heard about the boxcar is true. Boxcar was from Westerbork to Theresienstadt. It was 36 hours. It's a typical boxcar that you've seen pictures of. That was the standard form. We were given we had some water, and but very little, no food. Anything you needed, you had to bring on with yourself. And they had a slop bucket, for waste. That was it. Fortunately, September is relatively cool. It was only 36 hours, and we had enough room, I guess you could lie down or sit. But a lot of these were filled, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. But my father describes it, it was not the greatest way of transporting, obviously. No windows. You just had the 2 windows, small windows for ventilation. So it was pretty much direct from. I don't really remember that much about it, so I can't speak to that. I remember when we got there, we were separated. My brother and father were put in one barracks. My mother and I were in another barrack, and so forth. Initially. So then, because of all these people were starting to be shipped out from the ghetto to primarily Auschwitz, they needed additional workers. So my mother ended up working in the hospital, and so she was able to get extra rations, not just for herself, because when people died, when the people were dying in the hospital, they wouldn't tell the Germans immediately. So we continued to get their rations. My father had the same situation. He worked in a laboratory testing flour, and if they had excess, they would distribute it. My brother contracted tuberculosis at that time and ended up spending most of his time in the hospital, so that was not the greatest, obviously. I remember at the end, the people from Auschwitz were being brought through. They were placed in a segregated area, and many of them were sick. They had typhoid and so forth. And this was right near the end. I mean, this was like in April, March and April of 1945. And you could hear a lot of the people, you could hear the noise from these barracks. And the people were, a lot of them were just, were no longer mentally capable and so forth. I mean, they were just skeletons going through. 1944, October, November, were the last roundouts from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the only death camp still in operation at that point. And my father knew what was happening, and he thought we were going to be rounded up as well. War ended May 8th, 1945. In the beginning of May, the Germans ran away, abandoned the camp, the fortress. And as I said, there were about 20,000 or more people than that there at the time, after the 15,000 came. And they ran away, and this Czech Red Cross came in and ran the camp. And then several days later, the Russians came in and quote-unquote liberated the camp. We stayed there for several weeks after that, and then we were turned over to the Americans because of our papers, and also we were from the western part of Europe. And the Russians turned us over to the Americans, and then we ended up for about a month in a DP camp. That was run by the Americans. In June of 1945, we were allowed to go back to Amsterdam. They finally shipped us back, back to Amsterdam, and we ended up receiving a furnished apartment previously occupied by a Dutch Nazi who was imprisoned. My father went back to work immediately. My brother started school in the fall, went back to school in the fall, and I started school in the fall as well. At that time, I was 7. Just as give you an idea, out of the 130,000 Jews roughly that were in Holland, only about 100,000 were shipped out. The other ones were either in mixed marriages and were protected from deportation, or they were hidden. Okay, there were about 20,000 Jews that were actually hidden with the help, with the local population, and 2/3 of those survived. Of the 100,000 Jews that went to the camp, which represented about 75% of all of them, only 5,000 returned. And of the 5,000 sent to Theresienstadt, only 1,200 returned. So you can imagine, and Holland of the Western Europe, had the highest death rate among Jews of any of the Western Europe countries. Obviously, Poland was much worse, and some other parts in Eastern Europe were much worse. But for one of the lowest rates actually were in France, because they hit a lot of people. Their record keeping wasn't great, and many of them for a long time were living in an area called Vichy France, which was kind of, and many of them escaped, including my sister-in-law ended up there and then ended up in Switzerland. So it depended by country, it varied dramatically. In 1948, my brother had graduated high school, secondary school, what is called there, was ready to go on to college or university. And the Russians at that time were on the move again, and we were concerned about that because there was nobody to stop us. They didn't have NATO yet at that time. And this is when they had the Berlin airlift and everything else going on. So my parents decided, and we had no, as I said, no relatives, so my parents decided maybe it's time to go to the United States. We got a visa Again, I did not have citizenship, so I had to get special exit permits to get out. But we came to the United States in July of 1948. I was almost 10. I we stayed a little bit with my, and the reason we in a place and settled in Paterson, New Jersey. Anybody familiar with Paterson, New Jersey? Hey. Well, why? Because my aunt and uncle had gotten there earlier, because these were the couple, they were the ones that had been in Dominican Republic and got into the United States earlier, and they settled there, and they sponsored us. Now, we did have relatives in the United States that we're still in touch with, obviously. Pretty much most of them in the Northeast. Anybody know Henry Winkler? You've heard of him? Well, he's my second cousin. Well, he was born later. He was born in the United States later than that. But his parents were ones that were able to get out before the start of the war. So we settled in Paterson, New Jersey, and then we were in the New York area. From there, the life was normal. My brother started university. I went to private regular school, and but they didn't have anything special for me. So I was thrown into classes immediately. They put me in the 5th grade. I immediately said, "Okay, you're here. You catch up." Now, math and science, I was in good shape. Obviously, I didn't know any English. I knew German and Dutch, but that was it. So I had, but when you're 10 years old, you learn the language very quickly. Also, there's nobody else not that many to talk to. And both my family spoke English. And when they came to the United States, they primarily spoke English. And my brother spoke with a British accent because he learned English in the Dutch school system, and they learned British English. So, and, so forth. But in any event, and from there it was pretty straightforward. Been here, I was in finance and administration, primarily in the New York area. Most of my time I worked in New York City. We came down here 26 years ago, I guess, in 1994, 27 now, and lived here full-time since then. But I became a citizen in 1955 on my own because of the timing. My parents first became citizens, and then I became citizen because of the fact that they were citizens. I became. At that time, I turned 18, so that was kind of the timing on it to a degree. But if you notice one thing, my prior nationality, El Salvador. Okay, I've not been there. I'm unique for a retiree in the sense that all of my children live in Florida, and my grandchildren, obviously, 2 of them in Naples. And so I'm fortunate. And we have Passover on Saturday night, the holiday, and all of them are going to be there. We see them regularly. So that's my story. Feel free to ask questions. I'll answer. Doesn't matter what it is. So I'm available for anything you can ask.
And here we have the man himself. What a wonderful story that you told on the video recording. I did
Only
provide,
a year older.
right? I
Almost
did
a year
provide
older.
our YouTube live audience a link to the original video, as well as letting them know that you do speak at the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center. So we did receive 2 questions during the video. One was, Rob, how was your experience in the ghetto?
Well, I was fortunate because living in the ghetto, I ended up in the Jewish council that internally ran the camp for the Germans had set up a daycare center. And so I ended up going there during the day because both my parents were working. My brother at that time was not available either. So that kind of brought a sense of normalcy in my life. And also they were able to get some additional rations. So I did not have, I was better off than most people at that point. And at night, I was staying. We were living in this one room, and we were all together, bug infested as well. But as I said, and we were, as it was pointed out, we wore civilian clothes, whatever we were able to get. So, but the diet was not the greatest, and so we've all had. Me less so. Have had dental issues and other health issues as well.
Yeah, and I know that you spoke about it to an extent about the ghettos within the video. One question was, were the ghettos dirty or unclean? And I know that you had mentioned that they were kind of population run, but...
Well, you didn't have any resources there, really. I think you saw some of the pictures of the conditions in the ghetto. Cleanliness was not a high priority. Access to showers or anything like that was minimal, if any. So, and that's one of the reasons you had disease. As I mentioned, 20% of the population there that went through the ghetto died in the ghetto from disease and malnutrition. So, but that becomes secondary. You just try to stay alive and do whatever you can. And I don't know how you equate it to anything, our normal life experiences, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, there was, I suppose, some sense of normalcy with the creation of a currency, the creation of ration cards, and trying to conduct life and business in a normal fashion. But I wouldn't imagine that it was normal at all.
Well, it's hard to say. Again, I had my family. So we were together. So that changed the dynamic somewhat. And there was nothing striking that I saw other than when the prisoners came from the other camps in April. And that stuck with me quite a bit. Seeing them, the conditions, and also I don't think I mentioned it in the film, but where we were staying was separated by a big fence, but was right pretty close to where we were living, where they were being held. And one point, a cabbage seemed to have been thrown over the fence, and I threw it back across the fence back to them because that was food. I mean, a big deal about cabbage. But my parents were not thrilled with that because they thought it might have been because they touched it, that it might have been diseased or anything like that. So they were upset with me when they heard I threw it back over the fence. And I remember that one well. So
I did see that fence that you were talking about within the film. There were a couple pictures of it where you could kind of see it was a tilted type fence with barbed wiring, right, that separated the ghetto from the city. I did place
the ghetto. Much of the city, the portion of the city had been part of the ghetto actually, and some of it had been used by the officers, the Germans and so forth, for them. So people ended up eventually living in some of those spaces again. And today today that ghetto, there are about 5,000 people. When we were there were about 5,000 people living there. So,
I suppose my curiosity as we wait for other questions to come into the chat, in the city that you grew up, are remnants of that fence still there as kind of a memorial,
no, the
or
fence,
some sort of historical
no, the
significance?
fencing, that fence is gone.
Okay.
Uh, what they did is they opened it up. It's a museum now, and you saw some of the art from the kids that is in there. And then they also opened up the small fortress, which was the concentration camp, which you saw some of the pictures. And that was actually a concentration camp. And it also was the case where people were taken, if they disappointed the Germans, they would be imprisoned there. That was where the prison was. That's also where they executed people. They didn't do that in the ghetto itself. They did that in that small fortress. And if you go there today, the tour is primarily, there's a tour of the small fortress showing the barracks there, but most of the ghetto is closed off now. It's not available for public viewing, other than the museum and so forth.
It's very interesting. While we wait for questions still to come in through the chat, would you discuss what you do for the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center in Naples?
Well, the museum started as a school project. Florida is one of 13 states or so that required teaching of the Holocaust in the 8th grade. So people that are watching the program may be familiar with that if they've gone through the school system here. But we are now. The museum came out of a school project which was back in 1997 in one of our middle schools, and several years later, and it was a traveling exhibit. It was set up, and it had artifacts that had been donated by different people. With a local person, Homer Helter, who had a memorabilia shop, and he provided a lot of artifacts for us to use. And so the museum was started in 2001. It opened 2001, 2002 that year. And where we are today is our third location. We've been there since 2019. So I've been a member of the museum from the beginning. Then in 2005 is also when they recorded my story, which is quite lengthy, obviously, much longer than a half-hour program, much more detailed question and answer type, which is the program they were running, and they still have done that consistently. And then I also started becoming a docent here. And I've been since 2005, I'm a docent. I've helped in special programs. We bring 8th graders to the museum. We run special programs. I've been involved in those. I give tours, both to the students and to the adults on our general time when we're open, or special private groups as well. So survivor talks, general talks about other topics of the Holocaust, as well as doing tours is my focus right now.
Wonderful.
And by the way, we also go to schools. I didn't mention that. We have an outreach program. We have a boxcar that is on permanent loan to the museum, or at least temporary permanent, which is a traveling boxcar. I thought it was going to be up at the Florida Southwestern. I don't know whether it made it up this year. But normally it had, in the past before COVID, it had for the week of the Holocaust week. And so we man that at times, depending on where we go. I gave a talk last week to 300 eighth graders in one of our middle schools. So this is not unusual. I've gone into some of the schools locally where I've talked to different groups, and I talked to 800 students. We talked to almost the whole school, really. So we reach out with, and we're available, and that's part of what we do. So we reach about 20,000 students a year, and we have we had over 10,000 visitors to the museum. So annually now. Well, obviously that fell off during the last 2 years, but it's starting to come back now. We're open. We closed down for a relatively short period of time in 2021, and 2020 into 21. But we've been open almost, quite a while now on a restricted schedule with masking and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I know that we have Cody from the museum speaking to us on Thursday, showing us artifacts and histories of displaced persons. And he'll be transmitting to us live here on YouTube from the Holocaust Museum in Naples. And I know that before the COVID pandemic, we certainly had numerous partnerships and opportunities to have you in person, as well as, the different museum displays
there's some
available.
There's some more survivors that probably have been at the school this week or through Zoom. There's several people working with the museum that live in the Fort Myers area, for example. But the reason the museum is in Naples is because of what the project, but also because so many liberators, as well as survivors, lived in Naples, came down to Naples. Most of those have passed away, obviously, now.
That's very interesting to know. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in from our YouTube live audience, but I do want to thank you for joining me here on YouTube today, and I want to thank our audience for rolling with our little bit of technical difficulty at the beginning where they were not hearing the video's sound.
Well, you went back and started it over, so it was all right. Yes. It was just a small glitch. Technology at work.
Definitely. We're still blooming with this technology, but I do invite any and everyone who is watching live or who will watch this video after it airs.
The one thing I'd like to stress
go for it,
Stephen, is the fact that this program was recorded and is on YouTube. And so it's visible to anybody. They could log into the Holocaust Museum website and go through YouTube to the site and mine is not the only story out there. Okay. So, I mean, there are other stories and stuff on the website. So if people are interested, go to hmcec.org and that'll take you to the Holocaust Museum website.
Wonderful. Yeah, I did place in a link to the museum's website. So it's very easy to click and access. And I certainly want to thank you again.
We welcome people to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I put it up there so you can get the individual ticket and docent-led tours and group tours and find out more information about the museum and the opportunities and educational resources that are available within that website.
Well, thank you.
So thank you again, Rob, for joining us tonight.
My pleasure,
And thank you all for joining us in the YouTube live world. And with that, I think we're both going to head out for the evening. There will be morning programs beginning at 10:30 11 o'clock tomorrow morning with Professor Sarah Gutwallace. She is providing a lecture titled "We Had Barely Begun to Live," examining the Morgan juvenile concentration camp. So definitely stay tuned for that.